to the Construction Big Breakfast, where we give you a hearty serving of insider tips and business strategies to help fuel your day so you can thrive in the construction industry. Now, here's your host, Tip Top Tim Fitch.
And hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Construction Big Breakfast podcast with me, your host, Tim Fitch. And this week, I've got a very good friend of mine, Andy Allen. Introduce yourself, Andy.
Morning, everybody. So yes, I'm Andrew Allen. I have for a long period of time worked in investment management in the real estate sector. So I've most recently been head of research and strategy at investment management businesses. So those are the investors who represent, the managers represent the pension funds and insurance companies that in our case invested in real estate around the world, offices, shops, office blocks, industrial sheds, residential. And I was head of research trying to work out where we should invest and what we should think about.
So Andy, a veritable guru on the property sector, but are you a guru in the breakfast sector? So come on, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
Well, Tim, so I went for 2 courses this morning, so I've been very good and had my fruit and muesli, but I've also had what the Portuguese refer to as marmalade, and just in the Blue Peter way, here's one I prepared earlier. So I have had my homemade quince jelly. So just as a small factoid for you, turns out that the Portuguese is marmelo. And so that's quince jelly in Portuguese is marmalade. Yeah.
Well,
there's a fact.
You heard it here first, folks. That's marmalade means something different in Portuguese than it does in good old English. So that, I have to say, that's probably the most informative thing we've actually said about breakfasts. And this is episode 35 or something. So you've already demonstrated your deep learning and, in this case, cultural knowledge. I'll just let everyone know I had my fairly normal breakfast. I had two soft-boiled eggs with toast this morning, which is what I usually have mid-week. Anyway, on to the meat and potatoes, which neither of us had for breakfast. I've known Andy, well, it must be 12 years now.
Yeah. Because
we met, if I remember correctly, I think the first time we met, I was trying to demonstrate, or my impression of what it would be like to give birth. Because we were at an antenatal class, weren't we, with our wives and a few other people in Cheshire all those years ago. That was one of the exercises, so we could empathise. So we bonded over a fake birthing.
Yes, there we are.
Anyway, that's another factoid. So Andy, we live in interesting times. So the whole world of work, offices, and presumably property investment is turned upside down.
Yeah, completely.
What's happening?
Well, the subject's enormous, Tim, and I assume your audience is mostly the specialists in the construction sector, so sort of distant cousins of the sector that I've been in. So yours, the brains behind getting things built, and ours, the perhaps brains that invest in these things. The built environment, and there's always changes in the built environment, and I think that the obvious issue with COVID is that it's really accelerated some of the fundamental changes that were happening anyway. And we could talk about all of those sectors all day, but perhaps one that's most interesting to your audience, your clients and so on, is what's going on in the office sector. I think retail people would understand that's been really damaged by the change online, but there are some changes within the office sector too, and COVID really accelerates that. And I think what we probably should talk about is the risks that creates in this market, and is it bad, is it good, is this the end of offices as we know it? How do the employers think about this? How do they marshal their troops to do the things that everyone wants them to do? The long and the short of that is there's a great deal of change right now, and at this point in time, the short term, we don't really know yet quite what the impact this will have on values. Now, valuation is not perhaps the most interesting science, but it's going to really matter ultimately to your audience, because the value, the worth of these buildings that people invest in, ultimately will drive the business that becomes, that is the construction industry. Of course, if people aren't, if these offices are not worth as much as people first thought, or if the risk around these investments is changing, then that will alter the investors' appetite for these buildings. And so we are in pretty uncertain times as to what happens next. We're in a period of sort of hiatus, really, before people quite work out what's currently happening and what impact it really has. But it must be said that the risks in the office sector for investors is highly elevated, and that will create challenges.
Do you see obviously there's what's happening now, and then perhaps what might happen post, and I'm talking as an optimist now, post the end of the current crisis, which I hope is sooner rather than later, but I don't think anyone thinks it's going to end before April, do they? Don't think so.
Yeah.
What do you think? We're in a current crisis. No one knows what to do. But looking forward, I suppose there's various scenarios, isn't there? There's a vaccine, and we're all over it by the summer, and we get back to normal. And I suppose the other extreme is it's like the common cold. You can't get rid of it. It keeps coming back.
Yeah.
So on and so forth. Now, I'm not talking about how we're going to deal with it epidemiologically, but I suppose those two scenarios are interesting places to start when you start thinking about, well, what does the future of offices in major cities look and feel like?
Yeah, quite. And currently, so there's sort of short now, and then there's medium, sort of a few months away, and then there's the longer term. So obviously there's the world's biggest experiment of workforce employment, where those people who obviously lots of people aren't office based, but those who are office based have been sent home in this enormous experiment that in a positive sense has largely worked. Everyone will be familiar with how that's engaged, and that gets really interesting because you can read lots of stuff that suggests that people are very productive at home. So there's the optimists about home working would suggest that this works, that we can do Teams calls or podcasts or whatever else it might be. But we don't really know yet. We don't really know, medium term, long term, as to whether this is productive or not. I think the way that these things are calculated is for routine jobs. Can you write a report on X by this date? Then of course that can be done at a distance. But it doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of that work. It doesn't tell you anything about the collaboration. It doesn't really tell you about how the culture of businesses hold together. And I think you being an employer of many people, I'm sure you're feeling it. How do you marshal the people that you're working with and trusting, to think about the future together? Because of course, if you put people at a distance, they might start to drift away from the common goals that you're trying to achieve. With Brendan and the others, it's really quite difficult, and we don't know yet. This is an experiment that's very early stages.
I think there's another element to that, because there's the whole, how do you're right, keep the culture, how do you keep the energy and the innovation and all of that stuff up, which is what everyone's been talking about for many months now. But I think at this point in time that we've reached, sort of end of September, October, where this isn't going to end. Boris this time went from it will be over in 12 weeks to saying it's going to be at least another 6 months. I think everyone believes him, and that I've noticed not only with my own team, but I'm sensing it with our clients as well. That's a real downer on people personally. So I think there's a whole issue around the isolation, the feeling of helplessness, out of controlledness, not being able to plan holiday, all of that stuff. There's a dimension there that needs to be managed. It's a fact. We've got to, there's anxiety out there. There's all sorts of stuff which needs to be managed, and is a consequence of this way of working.
And well, the HR team. So HR teams are clearly waking up to the fact that they need to, support their managers in working out how to support people who are isolated at home. You and I have got the benefit of working in, high quality sort of private office spaces at home. But it's not about us, is it? It's about, the younger workforce coming through who haven't had the benefit of collaboration in an office setting. And, those water cooler moments that people talk about, that, the sparks of creativity, that is much more difficult to undertake now. And, where I was going with that sort of more medium term, longer term, I think there is a risk that it changes the structure of employers, such that, your business is relatively young, but there are functions of your business that you could, you already significantly outsourced. Do you have to have your own HR team, tax specialists, accountancy? The traditional business would have had all those sorts of things in house. And I think your core team obviously need to be core, but I'm not so sure that many of the legacy type office employers going forwards will think of it that way. If you've trusted people to be at home, which was always the risk, then maybe you can just trust an outsourcing company. Maybe the corporate structures change. And why I say that from an office investment perspective is it could change the nature of the headquarters buildings, for example. It could change the way that major employers think about their staff. If you've already trusted them to be from home, well, as I say, maybe they're outsourced. Maybe that changes the demand for these enormous HQ buildings. So then, that's a sort of bit out there, thinking, but it's not for the near term. But I think the culture of work, I think, is a really interesting area. And just on that, I used to work with some academics who, years ago, who were at BT back in the day, who were talking about telecommuting in the 80s. About the technology permitted people to work from home even then, but nobody trusted them to do it. Nobody trusted the workforce to do it. And now we've been forced. So that, as I say, the COVID has accelerated this fundamental change.
No, that's obviously a very pertinent point, which has been well made by lots of us. I'm a relatively slow adopter of technology, although I invested in all the gear. We're currently filming this on Teams over Teams. I had resisted myself using Teams meetings, and I insisted that all my staff went to see their clients, and in a sense because the clients expected it. So we used to spend a lot of time, a lot of money, all of our teams going around the country, attending meetings with the clients as part of doing our work. And now it's all done remotely, all of it. And it's not just us having to do that, the clients had to as well. And it was the fact that to have a Teams meeting, two people who are remote have to agree, don't they? That's the key thing. It's not just me, it's you.
Yeah.
And of course, before there was a resistance for all the reasons that we all in March. People of my age, but you should see people face to face and all of the stuff you can pick up, which is all true. But on the other hand, when you've got no choice, then the world's changed, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it gets more difficult because the near term issue for investors in offices, so the people I used to represent, what does that mean for them? So if you're thinking about investing in office, why do people do that? They tend to like the familiarity of offices, and I don't know how much your audience knows, but the people who typically own London offices may well be foreign nationals. They may well be individuals, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. It's a very, very global marketplace, one of the most global real estate marketplaces in the world, and so there's plenty of money there that wants to invest in those markets, and the reason they do it is because they like the income that comes off those buildings. It's very well, they believe it's very stable over the long term. It's actually one of the more cyclical markets. It always has been. They can deposit large amounts of money in these buildings. They can probably get a yield, a distribution of sort of 4 or 5%, over the long term. So that's pretty healthy. And of course, what's happening today is that interest rates are very, very low, as you will know. And on a relative basis, if fixed income investing pays you very little income, then real estate can pay quite a lot. So as much as there's negatives in this market and concerns, there is capital there that wants the income that comes off these properties. But the problem is what comes next, because we all know that people that there are obviously space standards and conditions within these office workplaces that have to be met, i.e. we need to be socially distanced at work as well as in places of leisure. And so there's a really interesting fundamental there too, because the trick for investors over the last few years is to less space. So the space density, i.e. how many workers you can get in a square meter, has been compressed. So the new towers may be 8 square meters a person, but in the 80s and 90s when I first started working, they might be 20 square meters. So you could get 2 or 3 times as many people into the same amount of space. Well, COVID's clearly turned that on its head. So if you now need more space per worker, then of course the effect of that is that the cost per worker of the floor space is more. So it's gone up, whereas it was falling for 15 years. So not only has it gone down, not only do you have more space per worker, but the flexibility that the occupier wants is going to be much greater, because they're not entirely sure what happens next. So they won't want to sign long leases. 20-year leases are relatively uncommon now. It's more like a 5 or 10-year lease. And so with shorter leases, more cost per worker, probably more cost per worker of the operation of the building as well, because I'm no expert in the the sanitization and so on, but there are cleaning techniques that will be required, that will be there'll be moderations in the place that are required, whether there's screens or something else. So that ultimately means that operating these offices is more expensive as well. So you've got shorter leases, you've got more cost per worker of operating the desk, just the physical amount, and then also costs of running it, and that risks more depreciation and obsolescence. So what that means in investment language is the risk premium of investing in offices is going up. Now, that's not to say offices are necessarily a bad investment. It just means that investors need to be much, much more careful, and you would expect values to shift.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm talking about our own situation now. We've made our office COVID secure, and that means all of the stuff you've said, Andy, which is we've got screens, we've got extra cleaning, we've got hand wash gels and all the rest of it. Plus we've got a protocol to reduce the occupancy at any one time. We've got a self-developed app so we can manage all of that stuff. But you're quite right, even in our office, and you've been to our office, which is not densely populated in terms of, there's plenty of space for every person. Even that, we've had to limit how many people could be there at any one time. Plus, what we've now noticed is, and of course we're still in a semi-lockdown, is that people are interacting much more as we are, exactly as we speak, talking at a computer, and the acoustics in our office don't work.
Okay, interesting.
Because if you've got more than one person talking, it doesn't work. So we need to, now there might be a technological way of dealing with that, having a more sophisticated headset with noise cancelling and all of that stuff. That might help, special microphones. But the fact is, people have got used to working in a spare bedroom, or if you're lucky enough to have a spare room in your house with the door closed or open, depending on the temperature and who else is in the house. You can do that, but in the office it doesn't work. And so, although you've been to our office, we've spent a lot of money having it all fitted out. It was all fitted out for the old way of working, and now it needs rethinking. Now, if ours needs rethinking, I expect most other offices will, because they're set up for a particular way of working, which has changed now.
Yeah.
So, some people in our case can work from home most of the time. They're going to want to go in the office occasionally. We want them to. We want them to be able to collaborate face to face when it's safe to do so. But the office shape and style of the office will change. It needs to.
Yeah, and as you say, that's the case for everybody, and I don't think that's necessarily all bad. The senses I'm getting are that smaller suites, smaller office buildings are actually holding up relatively well. smaller companies quite happy to occupy as you do. But if you think about some of the, the market is not all the same. No, by no means are all offices the same. But if you think about some of the towers that have been built in the last few years in the city, you really have to question how that works now, because how do you get the people up, the 15, 20, 30 stories, whatever they are? The capacities of the lifts won't be quite right. It really changes the efficiency of those buildings. That's not to say people don't want to work in offices. It's just to say that is much more difficult. It would suggest that lower rise buildings where people are more able to walk up the buildings, less plant and machinery in them, more flexible space, that market would hold up better. And the bit we haven't talked about, we both live in the suburbs, but people aren't confident about using public mass transit to get to places of work. So we were in the West End last week, and I've been in the city recently, and it's very, very quiet. And understand, until that's sorted out, people are not going to want to go to those locations, which of course exacerbates this issue.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I'm agreeing with you. I mean, we both live on the Metropolitan line, which we're lucky in the current circumstances. It's very quiet. It is air conditioned. But if you're trying to go north-south on the Northern Line, or even east-west on the Central Line, my colleagues who are using that say it's still pretty busy, and there's no chance of complying with what we are told is the safe social distancing. Whereas on the Metropolitan Line, you can. You can travel into town even at the old-fashioned rush hour, get on the train at 10 to 7, and there won't be anyone sat within 2 meters of you.
Yeah.
And even coming back, which is always more tricky, it still feels relatively safe. It's just unpleasant having to wear that mask. But if you're coming east-west on Central or on the Northern Line, they're telling me it's not as busy as it used to be, but it's it's nowhere near as safe feeling.
Yeah.
So there's an issue there. I don't know about you, Andy, but I'm one of those people that even at my, in my late 50s now, I still get excited walking out the door in the morning and walking to the station, getting on the train to go into London, because it's exciting.
Well,
except it was. Now I'm not too worried about the train journey. I just hate wearing the mask. I accept you've got to. I'm not a face mask denier. It's just I don't like wearing it. But the buzz is gone.
Yeah.
The buzz is gone because everyone staying around. Of course, it changes the dynamics of the whole system.
Well,
and of course, the thing I know really well is TfL. Of course, the finances of TfL are shot because since 1975 they've had 7% passenger growth until last year, actually, year on year, and now there's no, it's losing money hand over fist every day because of the ridership down.
In 2014, when I was at Aberdeen, we wrote something called How to Invest in Global Winning Cities, which was about that sort of observation, really. And I was writing about why is it that global investors are obsessed by offices per se, and there's good reasons why they should invest in offices. But the fundamental point behind that work that we did was to say that there's something special about cities generally. And we increasingly, over the last 20, 30 years, have recognized that cities are very sensible places to live, work, have leisure, healthcare is better, education and attainment is better, transport infrastructure is better. And people tend to forget why values of things in London have risen as much as they have. And the reason being is that the zone around London is constrained by the green belt, and more people wanted to be in the middle of it. And so the quip there is that over 10 years, London grew by about 1 million people. So that's 100,000 a year. That's, to put that in your mind, that's something like a train full of people arriving in London every week and not going home. It's an extraordinary thing. So of course that density, that intensification was fabulous. Now, what happens next? Now, the reality is that London is quite a young population. It's a very fertile population. It produces lots of kids. And so it's naturally growing anyway. And as much as people talk about suburbanization, it's very difficult to do that because there's nowhere to go, because the suburbs are already full. There's a slight noise on the background, but I don't know whether you can hear that, Tim.
I can, but nothing we can do about it.
It's gone now. Yeah, so the suburbanisation isn't really possible. So it's not really possible to suddenly place all the people who live in central London in the suburbs, because the suburbs are full and people get very, caring about greenbelt and creation of new towns and so on. So I'm not a believer in London is dead at all. And I'm, as you said right at the outset, I think this comes back to whether COVID, I think we learn to cope with it, like we do the flu and HIV and so on, that we, the treatments get better, the conditions under which it's controlled get better, and that seems to be the central case for me. And as we get better at controlling it, then I think we'll see a natural drift back to the CBD. But whether that's the same for offices, I don't know, because you can't have everyone saying they want to work in the office 3 days a week. That really does change the fundamental of the office sector. It doesn't make it bad; it just changes it.
Is there? I mean, this is something I've been pondering. I'm sure others have as well. That if the nature of the office changes and people work in the office part-time and part-time elsewhere, whether it's at a home office or somewhere out in the burbs or in Starbucks or wherever, does that create an opportunity to convert some of the excess office space back into resi, and people could then move back into the city if it becomes more affordable?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes. So there's some government like a planning guidance, which is if you want to put a porch over your front door, you'd be able to do that under permitted development rights, PDR. And that logic has been extended to the conversion of offices to residential. So as long as you do that to a certain building regulation standard, that's a relatively easy process. And yeah, I used to be responsible for a fund that did exactly that. That it took commercial buildings and created residential with a view to selling them on. And I think it's exactly what you'll see. Much more of that, because the one thing we don't have is anywhere near enough residential. The office vacancy rate might be 10 or 15%, but the residential vacancy rate is pretty much nil. There's no chance in our lifetime we'll build enough residential. So reusing old commercial buildings makes sense. And what that's doing, that's making the vacancy rate for offices in the suburbs drop like a stone, because all the old rubbishy stuff is being taken out. The flat, the sort of offices above shops in old high streets and things like that. And that's a good thing, right? So what that naturally will do over time, it will reduce the supply of poor offices, and it will increase the tension in that market again, which will ultimately hold the values up better. So it's a really interesting point you make, because it's actually the residential is the big story here, because we just can't build enough stuff.
Yeah. So I suppose what we're really saying is that dealing with this epidemic doesn't mean we've got too many buildings. They're just in different places to where perhaps they need to be, and they're set up for a particular purpose which may need to change. Yeah. And of course, to overcome that, there's some positives and negatives. But I mean, if people can move back into living in the city more affordably, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the fact that these things get repurposed, it provides more living space, more flexibility in the city. I'm putting a really positive spin on a difficult situation, but I can't help it. That's what I'm like.
Well, yeah, I think that's right, but it won't be like that in sub markets of London. So the square mile is the City of London Corporation is finds it difficult to concede that residential is a core activity in that market, and I understand that logic, because it's a place of financial services, which typically are in towers which won't convert well to residential, nor would people particularly want to live there. So it might not work very well in a X square foot, million square foot skyscraper, where the floor plates aren't quite right. Not all floor plates will convert to residential. So it does need thinking about. If people read about this subject, they'll see comments about slums of the future. There are some very shoddy refurbishments of bad offices to become bad small apartments with homeless people and
I've seen that. I've seen some of those.
It's a dreadful, and there's no need for it to be like that. It can be relatively easily controlled, but it must be true to say there's a positive there, and that must be about offices ultimately becoming something else. Only 5 years ago, there was a survey of investor intentions towards office parks, those things like Stockley Park, Chiswick Park, and so on. And there was pretty much near universal dislike of them at that point, because the suburbs weren't where it was at. And so the office values there dropped like a stone. But of course, now you'd expect those to be rising very fast because it's car-borne access. These things surround the M25. That could be a very positive place to be. You might well find some of your clients repurposing old retail premises to create offices. It's not out of possibility.
Yeah, I think we'll probably end it there on that positive note, because you're right. I think if you're in the office fit out, the cut and carve type subsector of the construction industry, the medium term future is extremely bright, because there's going to be a lot of repurposing, isn't there?
Yeah,
a lot of repurposing, and I can just see if you're good at doing that, it's going to be a very bright future once we've just got over the hump of the epidemic. Andy, that's been a fascinating discussion, which I really thank you very much for coming on. I think we could have probably gone on for hours and hours and hours. We learnt about the quince jelly or marmalade. For those of you who are listening in from Portugal, you'd know that. It's been tremendous. So we may well get Andy back on later, because obviously that discussion, we could have gone for hours and hours and hours. So thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Construction Big Breakfast, and we'll see you on the next episode, which will be showing in a couple of weeks' time. So thank you and goodbye.
All right. Come to Invennt for the highest R&D tax credit you can claim. We help construction businesses get back millions in tax credits every year. Contact us today for a free review. Thanks for joining us this week on the Construction Big Breakfast. Make sure to visit our website, www.inventt.com, where you can subscribe to the Construction Big Breakfast on all platforms, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a positive rating. Or if you'd simply share it with a friend, that would help us out too. Be sure to tune in for our next episode.